Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming tonight. We are so grateful for your time and can't wait to share our findings with you. My name is Amelia Anthony and I'm a sophomore studying English and Urban Studies.
I'm Phoebe Ayers, I'm a senior in Urban Studies.
I'm Hillary, I'm also a senior studying Urban Studies and English.
I'm happy to do it if you just want.
And we had two other group members who couldn't be here tonight. One of them is studying abroad and the other one is in San Francisco.
Yeah. This work was guided and led by questions from the Rhode Island Center for Justice, Science of Providence, and DARE. We're building upon the works of past teams of eviction researchers, such as the group of students from last year, Matthew Desmond's Eviction Lab, and Science of Providence. We're so grateful for all of their knowledge that guided this project. Eviction is the process in which a tenant is removed from their house by their landlord. This happens because their rent hasn't been paid for whatever reason or for a violation of their lease. It's a legal procedure that takes place inside district court. Illegal informal evictions also exist, but it's an entirely separate research project. This type of large study of evictions is unprecedented. Although these records are public, the current online system obscures larger trends. You can only search for one name or one record at a time. In this way, the public records in Rhode Island are basically designed for landlords to do a background check on a tenant. So far, we only have basic and anecdotal evidence of the eviction crisis in Providence and Rhode Island so far. Community members and service providers know that eviction is a problem in our state. However, in order to make real change legislatively, we need to back our stories up with data.
We wanted to go at this topic with a mixed methods approach. So as it was mentioned, we had a data set that we used from the city, and for that made up the information for our quantitative side of things. And then we also relied on interviews and observations for a qualitative side, and we thought it was really important to go at it in sort of those two different ways, because some people are numbers people and some people are more compelled by storytelling, and the two of them, when they're brought together, come up with a very strong case for reform.
With that, I'm going to be talking about the quantitative side of our project. We were guided by four main research questions. Firstly, which areas in Providence and the state experience the most eviction filings? Secondly, who are Providence's biggest evictors? Thirdly, what is the breakdown of eviction filings from various categories of plaintiffs? And here throughout the presentation, plaintiffs and landlords will be used interchangeably. And lastly, what is the breakdown of tenant versus landlord legal representation in court? To answer these research questions, we relied on three factors of our methodology. Firstly, as Phoebe and Amelia have mentioned already, we were, with the help of the Swear Center, we managed to purchase a data set from the district court, and this covered every single eviction filing in Rhode Island from 2016 to 2018. And when we were cleaning this data set, we made sure to block out the tenant column to protect that client confidentiality. Secondly, we used software like Stata and Excel to do some descriptive data analysis. That's where you see most of the numbers in the presentation. And lastly, we used GIS to kind of map the spatial spread of eviction filings in Providence and Rhode Island. So here is a map of the overall kind of look of eviction filings in Rhode Island. From our data set, we managed to find out that there was an average of 8,000 evictions that were filed in the state each year. And this map is just here to show you that even though most of the eviction filings are concentrated in Providence and some parts around it, like Woonsocket, evictions really do affect every single town in Rhode Island, and it is a big issue that we're facing in the state today. The rest of this presentation will only focus on Providence, so that's just a big clarifying point. From our data set, we looked at each year, 2016 to 2018, how many evictions were filed in the city. Mostly the filing numbers stayed consistent, but what's really important here is that about 80% are 9-day evictions as opposed to 20-day evictions. And this is really important because 9-day evictions are related to the non-payment of rent. So this is directly related to people's income and their ability to pay, whereas 20-day evictions are filed because of a lease violation. So we thought it would be really appropriate here to talk about this Matthew Desmond quote, who authored Evicted, and here he says that eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty. And we think that with the huge number of 9-day eviction filings, it's really important to note that 50% of Providence's households are cost burden right now, which means that 30% of one's income goes to rent. And this really puts them at a greater risk of not being able to bounce back from unexpected causes, such as medical bills or if they are like suddenly laid off. So we think that this quote is really appropriate in light of the 80% 9-day eviction statistic. We're going to go through a little bit of the GIS maps that we kind of made for this project, and we thought it would be interesting to kind of look at how the average eviction filing rate affects different neighborhoods in Providence differently. How we calculated eviction filing rate is that we took the average number of eviction filings from 2016 to 18, and then we divided that by the total number of renter-occupied households in the city. And we got this from census data. And we can see from the map here that most of the higher eviction filing rates are concentrated in places where there is a higher number of renter-occupied housing, which is why on the east side the dots are smaller. The map doesn't show up very well, but we also thought it would be very useful to talk about racial demographics and income demographics in relation to eviction filing rate. The reason why we used census data for this is because in the data set that we got from the district court, racial demographics were not recorded at all. So we don't know the race and the ethnicity of the tenants that we were looking at. We didn't know what their income levels were, so that's why we relied on census data for this. And we can see here that eviction filing rates are relatively higher in places where there are higher percentage of Black residents. Similarly, eviction filing rate is also pretty high in places where there are more Hispanic and Latinx residents. And we all know that Providence is home to a large population of Latinx residents, so this is pretty shocking to see. On the flip side, if we look at places that have a high percentage of white residents, eviction filing rate is relatively low, and you can see that that's concentrated on the east side and parts of the west side of Providence. And here we're kind of overlaying eviction filing rate data with median gross rent and income data. We can see here that places with a lower median gross rent experience higher eviction rates. And on the next slide, places with a higher household income experience lower eviction filing rates. So that concludes kind of the spatial component of our presentation. We kind of wanted to go into who exactly the landlords were in our data set, and after looking through the data set, we kind of analyzed that the landlords can be split into 6 main categories: corporations, individuals, trusts, finance companies, community organizations, as well as public entities. This is a pie chart that kind of represents the breakdown. Not sure if you can see it properly, but by and large, like the corporation plaintiff category makes up the highest amount of landlords in our data set with 45%, followed by individuals that hover around 40%. We are particularly interested about one group in the public entity section, which makes up 14% of our data set. Because we found out that 13.5% of all eviction filings in Providence were done by the Providence Housing Authority. And we thought this was pretty shocking given the fact that the Providence Housing Authority manages about 6.6% of the total renter-occupied households in the city. So that number is like almost twice that supply. So that was pretty shocking. From there, we kind of concluded that these were the top 10 evictors in Providence, with the Providence Housing Authority topping that list by a huge margin compared to the rest of the other top evictors. After looking at that data, we wanted to zoom in on the eviction court process and how that affects the different parties involved in evictions on a legal level. So here we compiled a list of the top 5 attorneys that were representing landlords in eviction court. It's really interesting to note that the top 2 names on this list here collectively represent 25% of all the eviction cases in Providence from 2016 to 2018. And the names that has asterisks next to them are people that our team managed to interview for the qualitative side of our project. So more info on that to come. And after doing a bunch of data analysis, we came up with a statistic that 100% of landlords in Providence are legally represented, while only a measly 7% of tenants in Providence are legally represented in eviction court. And later on, I'll talk a bit about how legal representation is really important in kind of changing outcomes for eviction cases. But before I do that, I want to talk a bit about monetary awards and how eviction courts in Providence kind of function as a means of debt collection among different parties involved in the process. So on the left side of the slide here, we see that this is the amount that tenants pay other parties in the eviction court process, while the right side represents the amount that landlords pay during this process. So the average amount that defendants owe plaintiffs, or tenants owe landlords in this case, tends to be pretty high because this tends to be back rent. So the mean hovers around $2,000 with a standard deviation of about the same amount. On top of that, tenants sometimes owe additional attorney's fees. And this is because in a lot of lease agreements between tenants and landlords, it states in the lease that if a tenant and a landlord were to bring a case to court and a landlord wins that case, then the tenant actually is responsible for paying additional attorney's fees for that landlord. That's why 50% of the defendants in the data set that we got, they owe additional attorney's fees on top of the back rent that they pay the landlord. So the mean for that hovers around $300, standard deviation around $100. And on the flip side of that eviction court process, we see that landlords pay a relatively lower amount of money to, I guess, like participate in the process. The mean of which is $90 and standard deviation around $200. So there's a huge disparity right there. And lastly, I want to talk about outcome judgments because it's important to note that when an eviction is filed, the removal of the tenant from the household isn't the only outcome that can happen. There are a range of outcomes that can happen, and legal representation is a huge part in changing those outcomes. By and large, the main outcome judgment that we saw in our data set was judgment entered, which means that the court has made a finding mainly for the plaintiff or the landlord. Default judgment entered makes up a surprisingly large amount in our data set too, and this basically means that the tenant just failed to show up in court, and that makes up about 20% of our data set. Case dismissed, our team kind of interpreted this to be a win for the tenant, although we want to clarify that this doesn't always mean that this was a desired outcome for the tenant going through this process in real life. But it usually means that the landlord and the tenant had worked out an agreement such that the case did not have to elevate to a court hearing. And this typically also means that the tenant was able to stay in their place of residence. Case dismissed with prejudice, we also saw interpreted to be a win because not only did they come to an arrangement, but it means that the landlord could not file a repeat complaint for the same issue. So the landlord could not come back on that particular complaint. And lastly, amended judgment entered just means that the judgment was changed for any number of reasons. For example, if the case had gone on for a very long time and more back rent was due, then it had to be changed. This is my last slide for the quantitative side of our project, but this really shows how much legal representation really helps in changing those outcomes for tenants. We kind of compared when tenants were self-represented in the data set versus those who are legally represented and how the outcomes changed. So on the self-represented slide, you see that default judgment entered, which means that the tenant failed to show up in court, was 22.7%, whereas when they were legally represented, this drastically went down to 4%. And similarly for case dismissed, which we interpreted to be a win for the tenant because it usually meant that they could stay in their place of residence. When tenants were self-represented, case dismissed was around 7.5%, whereas when they were legally represented, case dismissed increased to 14%. So I think this slide really just sums up how important legal representation is in basic stuff like making sure the tenant shows up to court, making sure that someone is there when a mediation is happening between the landlord and the tenant so that the tenant can gain a more favorable outcome. And Phoebe and Amelia will talk a little bit more about how right to counsel is so important in our city and how we can advocate for that on a better level.
Sweet. So now we're transitioning to the qualitative research questions. So we focused on these four, which are one, what are the varying perspectives of people involved in the eviction process? So this is tenants, landlords, lawyers, even judges. How does the process of eviction differ for all parties involved? What burdens to those experiencing evictions face? And finally, what can eviction reform look like?
We went about answering these questions predominantly by going to eviction court downtown, and there sometimes we would go just with the intention of observing, other times we went with meetings arranged. A lot of times we would just go and see if tenants were willing to speak with us. We interviewed judges, we attended meetings with various landlord attorneys. And then we also relied heavily on researching eviction reform that is going on in other cities to see how that could maybe be applied to Providence.
So what is the process like for a tenant? Kayla was a tenant who came and talked with us. Her name has been changed. But this is a quote that I think really illustrates the isolation and fear that a lot of tenants experience. I felt like I was stranded on an island all by myself. I was in a courtroom packed with people, but still felt so alone. It's a hyper-focused feeling. I felt like the biggest delinquent in the world. Many tenants we talked to explain these feelings of isolation. When we approached tenants in the courthouse, many obviously didn't want to talk to us at all. The imbalance of power and knowledge is all too apparent in the courthouse. And after the eviction, Kayla and her children were homeless for a couple months. So this is a quote from one of the landlord attorneys that we interviewed. I think he's the third most prominent or second in the state. So in Rhode Island, I think you play not only the attorney but also the mediator between the parties. But you're not really a mediator because the landlord is still your client. So pretty much in 93% of the cases, the landlord attorney is the only person that has like any knowledge of the process, and they have to sit down with the tenant and also the landlord, but sometimes the landlord's not even there, and kind of explain what their options are for them. Usually it looks like this: either like pay all the back rent, work out some sort of payment plan, and you can stay in your apartment, or you have to move out in as little as 5 days. Like sometimes you can get a stay, but like your options are pretty limited, and also you're up against, these men who have so much knowledge and they've got a stack of cases and you're one of 30 that they're doing today. And you have no one to work out your options with you, and often tenants get kind of pressured, or they feel like they have no other options but to sign a payment plan they can't afford, so they end up back in court for another eviction. It's basically a terrible process for unrepresented tenants, and that was really apparent in everyone we talked to.
And that process also goes on in the hallway of the district courthouse. It's not even in the courtroom. When the judge calls your name to check in that you're there, the landlord's attorney will kind of give you a nod for you guys to go meet out in the hallway where there's everyone else who has their court date on that day, and it's loud and it's crowded, and you kind of just wait in line until you can get up to your landlord's attorney, and they throw these options at you and then say, okay, sign this paper, and then tell the judge that you weren't persuaded in any way. So to set the scene a little bit more on what that looks like. We spoke with another tenant, Shannon, and her partner. They came very prepared to the courthouse. They did not have representation, but it was apparent that they had kind of done some background work. She told us that they had reached out to other services, Rhode Island Legal Aid, but everyone is so swamped with these cases already that a lot of people, if you go to them, they say you have a waiting, a period of waiting in which your court date would already be passed then. And so they did a lot of work on their own, and then they provided us with these screenshots of some Facebook messages that their landlord had written about them in some landlord Facebook group, kind of demonstrating an obvious abuse of power and potentially other just strange, sneaky behavior that doesn't bode well. The landlord was quoted saying, "Where can I buy bed bugs in bulk?" presumably an effort to get these tenants out. As this particular landlord was leaving the building, someone else, presumably another tenant he had taken to court, yelled at him, "You're a drug lord and a slumlord." So we don't know what was going on, but obviously it wasn't a good situation, and kind of continues to demonstrate the power imbalances and the different scare tactics that are used in these cases.
gonna skip this slide.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Or, yeah, just go one ahead, thanks.
Ooh.
Just skip. Okay, sweet. Okay, cool.
So we believe that all of this research wouldn't do much if action were not to be taken. We have identified some places for potential reform and heard various perspectives on what could help. Amelia and I are writing an article that is to be submitted to a few places. And we have, on the next one, oh, maybe it's later. There's a one-page handout that hopefully will be given out in court that kind of lists all of, like, sort of a Know Your Rights flyer. Oh, there it is.
This is good. Okay, so one area for reform is this idea of sealing eviction records. So basically, right now, what is essentially a filing error publishes eviction records on the public portal even when a tenant has won their case. As Hillary explained earlier, case dismissed means that nothing happened in the courtroom and the eviction didn't go through. A lawyer would know to ignore that. However, a landlord, when looking up their tenant's name, would see problem tenant because they have a record in the court. So seals in quotation marks because these records really shouldn't exist in the first place. We hope to help lobby for this legislation that will correct this error and preserve justice for tenants, because having an eviction in your record is severely detrimental towards your chances of finding future housing. As we want to make sure that people who don't deserve to have, or shouldn't have this record on their, shouldn't have an eviction on their record, don't have that record.
Another potential area of reform that has proven to be very successful in a few other cities is the guaranteed right to counsel. New York City became the first city to launch the right to counsel in 2017. Only 2 years later, 84% of represented tenants are remaining in their homes, and the eviction rate has dropped over 30% since implementation. That 30% statistic just really goes to show how sometimes landlords use evictions as a scare tactic, and if an eviction really isn't necessary, but the landlord just wants something else to happen, the eviction rate going down, the eviction filing rate going down means that everyone is generally healthier. That's fine. Next research steps.
Phoebe and I have applied for a summer research grant to continue our holiday of work this summer with Professor Zip. Pending approval of this funding, we will be continuing to observe court, speak with tenants, landlords, and lawyers, and hopefully working to lay out what would look like an eviction prevention program for Providence. And if anyone has any ideas for research direction, we'd love to speak with you.
Overall, everyone we spoke to, none of the players involved were against the guaranteed right to counsel, including the lawyers. They thought that maybe it would help. So enacting this kind of these kind of bills and seeing where this can play out in Providence would make a big difference.
And also, I'm still continuing GIS research this semester to kind of look at evictions on maybe a more street level basis, or also trying to get data from the Providence Housing Authority on more kind of narrowed down data on renter-occupied